for joining. Oops, there we go. Thank you so much for joining this webinar in collaboration between Sustainable Finance Geneva and the Obervatoire de la Finance. We are very excited to explore this topic of ethics and trust in finance, and to have quite an open discussion about some of the latest thinking on the topic. So a really quick background. I don't know if all of you can see this slide. If it's in full screen, there we go. Sustainable Finance Geneva is an organization here in Geneva that's very much focused on building a community of sustainable finance professionals who are looking to push finance to be more impactful, to have accountability, and to really achieve a sustainable future. So we are made up of more than 385 individual members, and we have 47 institutional partners who are financial institutions, NGOs, etc., who are all pushing to have the finance system do what it really is meant to do, which is facilitate a sustainable and just and inclusive society. So how we do that is we really work on building strong connections between actors here in the ecosystem in Geneva and beyond, empowering individuals to push for action in finance in their own spheres of influence. So whether that be working within a company or with their own purchasing power, with their own power as an asset owner in their pension fund, whatever it may be. And then, of course, mainstreaming impact and raising awareness on new issues that are important to be aware of, that go beyond kind of the mainstream discussion that's happening today. So we're looking at things like gender, ethics and trust, peace, human rights, nature, some of the newer topics on this journey in sustainable finance. So I'm seeing more and more people join. You are all so welcome, and thank you very much for being here today. We are joined by our partner from the Obervatoire de la Finance, Virgile Perret, as well as 3 of his speakers who are past winners of the prize. And I'm going to stop sharing and let Virgile share his screen and tell you a little bit about the Ethics and Finance Prize. Before I do that, I just want to note you can put any questions you have as we go in the chat, and we'll come to those in the question and answer. And just a reminder again to keep your microphone muted until the discussion period. So Virgile, over to you.
Hello, Kelly. Thank you. Thank you for hosting this event, and hello, everyone. Thank you for joining. Can you already see my screen or not yet? Let me check. I'm going to, yeah, no, works. So I'm Virgile Perret from the Obervatoire de la Finance. I hope you can now see my screen. Obervatoire de la Finance is a small foundation based in Geneva. And we are really happy to collaborate with Sustainable Finance Geneva on this topic of ethics in finance and sustainability, because I think the 2 topics have a lot of different connections. So I work with at the Obervatoire de la Finance and mainly busy with the coordination of the global prize called Ethics and Trust in Finance for Sustainable Future. We are now in the 9th edition. So I'm going to give you the key information about the competition, and then I will introduce our 3 alumni who are past winners of the prize, and they will present in a few minutes the essay. So yes, no. Sorry, I just had some issue with running the page. Yeah, now it's working. So the goal of the prize is to basically stimulate a global debate, a global reflection on the topic of ethics in finance, and to promote the role of trust and integrity in finance. It's also to engage the young generation. So it's for people under 35. It's for young professionals, but also advanced students. So it's both for professionals and academics who are interested and or working in all aspects of finance, including also the insurance sector. So anyone who is below 35, working or studying finance, is welcome to register for the competition and write an essay for the global prize. So, as I said, it's open to young professionals and academics under 35. The essays that you submit have to be in English. It's not a very long essay, it's 5,000 words. And your essay is evaluated by a jury of 25 international experts. Usually it's a mix of university professors, but also high-level professionals. And the jury is chaired by Josina Kamerling, who is at the CFA Institute in Brussels, and Professor Paul Dembinski, who is the director of the Observatoire de la Finance in Geneva. And last but not least, there's the award for the prize is $20,000 to be shared among the winners. So we are now in the 9th edition of the prize. You can see the strategic partners of the prize. CFA Institute is one of the most most ancient historic strategic partner of the prize, but also Euroclear, Pictet Group based in Geneva here, and Swift Institute. You probably know these institutions active in the sector of finance or payments, and they are all important supporters of the prize. So just 2 words on the history of the prize. It was started in 2006, actually to honor the intuition of a young investment banker called Robin Cosgrove. Initially, the prize was called the Robin Cosgrove Prize, but this young banker died at the age of 31, and when he died, the prize was created by his mom, actually to honor his intuitions, because he wanted to stimulate the debate about ethics in finance, and but he could not actually implement this project. So it's actually his mom and Professor Dembinski who created the prize in 2006 in memory of Robin Cosgrove. So it started very small, but now the prize has really become a global brand to promote trust, ethics, and integrity in the finance sector. And to give you just a few numbers, on the last edition, we had expressions of interest from 93 countries around the world. So it's really a global reach. We had candidates from many different regions and cultures. So that's also the interest of the prize, to have an international competition on that topic. So the prize is actually biannual, so it's every 2 years. This edition, the 9th edition, was launched last year. Usually, so there is a ceremony for the launch, as we had last year. Then there is the registration and collection of papers. Candidates have several months to actually register and draft and write the essay. And then there is the jury working to evaluate the essays. And at the end of this cycle, there is the award ceremony, which is usually organized in quite a prestigious institution. In the past, it was, for example, Banque de France. It has been also the IMF in Washington. Sometimes it was also the OECD. So it depends on each edition. And then the best essays of the prize are published in our review, which is called Finance and the Common Good. And our review is actually available on our website. And all the winning essays are also in free access on our website. You can find it at this address on the screen. And so it gives you an idea of the topics and the style and how it looks. And it would be good if you are interested to actually take a look at the past essays. So also 2 words on the topics. At the beginning of the prize, when it was created in 2006, it was before the financial crisis. So we had a lot of candidates interested in compliance, microcredit, ethical investment, corporate social responsibility. But after the financial crisis, the topics changed. We had more candidates writing about crisis, scandals, failures of markets, financial management, regulation, for example. And more recently, in the last editions, we had more emphasis on issues related to technology and also sustainability. Now, sustainability has become one of the key topics of the prize, but of course you are free to choose any topic related to ethics or sustainability in finance. So the profiles of the candidates, usually we have 50% of academics, I mean young researchers, 50% of professionals. For the academics, usually it's more for advanced students, maybe not bachelor, but at least I would say master students or young researchers. We also have an alumni network for the Global Prize. We had around 73 professionals from 30 countries. And with the alumni, we organize webinars, interviews. They sometimes contribute to the debate by writing articles. So this is also something on our website. You can find easily the profile of the alumni and some of the activities we have with them. So, and finally, the deadline for this 9th edition is very soon, but you still have time to register and to draft an essay. It's 29 May 23. It's very easy to register. You just go to our website on this link. You enter your data, and then you can register for the competition. So I invite you or anyone potentially interested to register or to circulate the information to anyone interested in the competition. So thank you very much for your attention. I will stop sharing my screen and introduce our panelists, alumni. So Julie, I will start with Julie Segal from Canada. Julie works as a senior manager climate finance at Environmental Defense, where she advances climate-related financial policy and regulation. She previously managed a portfolio of impact investment at the McDonald Foundation. Julie Segal was the first prize winner of the 8th edition of the Global Prize, and she was awarded for her essay called Justice and Sustainability, Pricing in Physical Climate Risk, which examines the impact of pricing in climate risk on environmental justice. So welcome, Julie, and thank you for joining us. Also, welcome Ross Murdoch. Ross is a lawyer at the Financial Conduct Authority in London, within its enforcement and market oversight division. Ross specializes in regulatory enforcement proceedings, particularly within wholesale financial markets, including market abuse, benchmark manipulation, and other market misconduct. Ross was awarded the first prize at the he was the first prize winner, of the 5th edition of the prize, and he was awarded for his essay called Behavioral Ethics and the Next Generation in Finance, which analyzed how behavioral ethics can enable young professionals in finance to understand the pressures they face and to become ambassadors for ethical decision making. And finally, welcome to Babatunde Onabajo. Babatunde is a programmer at ChurchMapped, which is a travel website and search engine that specializes in churches across the world. He's currently writing a book titled Corporate Social Responsibility in a Post-George Floyd World, which was shortlisted as a book proposal by the Financial Times and McKinsey in the Bracken Barber Prize. Babatunde is the first prize winner of the 6th edition of the prize, awarded for his essay When Banks Do Not Always Know Best, which examined the ethical implications of contactless cards and cashless society. So just to stress the fact that our alumni are speaking in a personal capacity, and their views should not be treated as reflecting those of the employer. So thank you to all of you for joining us. And I will give the floor to let the floor to Julie to present in a few minutes. I mean, maybe 5-7 minutes. The key point of her essay.
Great. Merci, Virgile. Thank you so much for the invitation to join today to Sustainable Finance Geneva as well. And thank you for the brief introduction to my paper, Justice and Sustainability, Pricing in Physical Climate Risks. Essentially, I'm highlighting, given a particular example, a weakness of ESG as an investment approach, given that it's exclusively risk-based, to the extent it doesn't look at the impacts that those financial decisions and processes have on the real world. I'll outline the ethical problem and show why it matters to investors as well as financial regulators. To make sure we're all on the same page, pricing in climate risk means that an investor integrates climate change related risks to determine the financial terms for the investment. So just another factor in that risk reward negotiation. An investor may choose to exclude investments with high climate risks from their portfolios or charge a higher cost of capital. And in doing so, the investor aims to mitigate their exposure to climate change. But when it comes to physical climate risk, it actually brings risks for the borrower and therefore for the whole systemic response to climate change. So a key distinction here that I'm looking specifically at physical climate risk. Often climate risks are defined as either under the category of physical, transition, and regulatory. Pricing in transition risks, meaning the social preference change for, let's say, high emitting industries, is positive for climate action because less demand for high emitting products means that investment capital will move away from those in the theoretical sense. But when it comes to physical risk, if climate change is determining the borrowing cost for vulnerable borrowers like small island states or at-risk communities, vulnerable regions end up being financially penalized for a globally caused problem of high emissions leading to global warming, leading to natural disasters that then affect their country or community. Of course, private investments help shape the prosperity of a region. Financial flows can stimulate development, which then has knock-on effects on human rights, their financial markets, and their ability to play a role in the global fight to mitigate climate change. So in some vulnerable countries need investment capital. Vulnerable countries certainly need investment capital to invest in cutting their emissions, so mitigation, or adapting to the dangers of climate change that are already locked in. And again, pricing in the physical climate risks, recognizing that a vulnerable region is at higher risk of a tornado or flood, rising sea levels, wildfires perhaps. This creates a degenerative feedback loop because let's look at the cost of capital here for that vulnerable region. If an investor is pricing in that higher physical risk, it makes it more difficult for that region, country, or community to access capital to invest in climate mitigation and adaptation, which makes them all the more vulnerable as time goes on. So a degenerative feedback loop caused by pricing in physical climate risk. Furthermore, even the best funded adaptation can't entirely counteract this investment penalty. Let's think about the Marshall Islands or Tuvalu, low-lying small island developing states, where adaptation can't cover a lot of the locked-in damage, which those countries did very little to contribute to in terms of their historical emissions footprint. So complete and reliable information is super important for investments, and I strongly endorse that. But pricing in the physical risks of climate change financially burdens the most vulnerable communities, subverting international equity and as a result, weakening global climate progress. Of course, currently in finance, most of the analyses are only risk-based. Pardon me? We're good?
Julie, yeah.
But to go to some of the principles of environmental justice, it shows that finance is actually an anomaly in still not thinking about this. National and international policy does consider principles of environmental and climate justice. In short, what that means, there's a lot of research on this, but in short, what that means is that the wealthier actors who have the highest historical emission footprint should be responsible, should be bearing the burdens of climate change if they are historically responsible and have the capacity to pay. Financial institutions have contributed to climate change by funding significant amounts of fossil fuel investments, even in the years since the Paris Agreement. And of course, of course, they've profited from those investments as well, which ties into those key factors of ability to pay and historical responsibility. If we look at global, international climate politics under the UN, even a lot of national climate policies, like a few here in Canada, environmental justice is front and center. I'll take a moment to recognize that fiduciary duty is the guiding principle for investors. That's the lay of the land. And compromising investment returns is not a feasible action for most investors. But environmental justice and global climate action is in fact essential for a stable financial system. In Europe and UK, you will use the term double materiality. In Canada and North America, we'll look at things through kind of the systemic risk. The financial system relies on many different systems to generate financial value, including the natural system, including global economic stability. And so the climate risks to a portfolio can't really be separated from the implications that those constituent investments are having on either worsening or mitigating climate change, especially for larger long-term investors like pension funds who are called universal owners, because the beta risk, the systemic risk, becomes significant if they're investing in a way that in the medium long term worsens climate change, worsens market stability. That comes back to bite, in short. So my recommendation is that to be effective in playing a role in climate solutions, the financial sector has to be held accountable and be thinking about the same environmental justice frameworks that guide other climate-related decision-making processes, like those at the UN, about differentiated responsibility based on historical contribution and ability to pay. Some of the solutions that I outline are recognizing that voluntary initiatives help show the first willingness and possibility, but that policy and regulation really needs to adapt to this fundamental shift in the financial system and future ability to generate value and to contribute value to society. I really like what Callie opened with, saying some of the mandate of Sustainable Finance Geneva is to recognize that finance should be facilitating a just society. And I think that's a very important part that a lot of our regulations, certainly in North America, a bit more on your side of the pond, still have to adapt to. So I'll leave it there, and thanks so much, and looking forward to the discussion.
Thanks so much for that, Julie. We will now go over to Ross for his intervention. I'll just spotlight you here.
Okay. Well, look, thanks, Callie, and to SFG for hosting today, and to Virgil. Obviously, really excited to revisit a topic actually that I haven't thought about in a little while, and it was really interesting hearing from Julie, and looking forward to hearing from Babatunde in a moment. I guess it's been 8 years actually since I wrote my paper, which is some time, and I remember thinking back to applying for the prize and looking at the jury and thinking, what possibly can I tell these very established people that they don't already know? And I thought long and hard, and I thought I was much closer to the start of my career at that stage, maybe not quite now, but than they were. And so I came up with the idea of looking at examining behavioural insights through the lens of a young professional starting out their career in finance. And I guess I like lots of other people, started my career. It actually started in 2008. So like a lot of people, Virgil talked about the financial crisis, the prize starting just before it. I guess when I applied for the prize, a lot of people were reflecting on it having happened, and that's obviously something that has had a big effect on a lot of people. And I guess as the tide went out on that crisis, it exposed a lot of financial wrongdoing. And I guess I spend my day job investigating and prosecuting financial misconduct. So it was really interesting for me to take a step back and look at why people engage in unethical conduct in the first place. Look, many of us define ourselves by the jobs that we do, rightly or wrongly, and often we're attracted to a role because of the values or beliefs that role is supposed to represent. But it's really only by doing a job that you find out what's expected of you. And I guess what happens if you're a good person, but there's an expectation from your colleagues or your superiors that you will engage in unethical conduct? What do you do? Do you challenge that expectation? We'd obviously all like to think so, but clearly we don't all do that. And I guess one of the reasons why we don't challenge unethical behaviour is that we often separate our work life from our persona in social contexts. Think about how people portray themselves on social media. Does that reflect the reality of what their lives are really like? And in a work context, that can leave us free to behave unethically in the workplace and ethically at other times. And that's one of the things I looked at in my paper. I mean, the reality is that both good and bad people do good and bad things. I think a far more accurate predictor of whether or not an individual is likely to be ethical or unethical is to examine the context in which they make their decisions. And there are a number of influences that can determine whether we behave unethically. We don't obviously have time to cover them all. I'll just pick out a few from the paper. One of the big things that I looked at was routine. Might sound a little bit mundane, but it's actually really important. Routine can blunt ethical decision making, where the question of ethics is removed entirely from the equation. I should say it doesn't necessarily excuse it, but it's important to understand why it happens. One of the examples that I referred to in my paper was LIBOR misconduct, and that was the epitome of routinized misconduct, where at 11 AM UK time, LIBOR submitters were asked to input at what rate their banks could borrow money. And as a matter of routine, they inappropriately took into account trading positions, a number of them, not all. Put yourself in their shoes at the time. More senior people who you want to impress come to you and ask for a higher or lower submission. You're just putting in a number. It takes little time out of your day, and it's the way it's always been done. What do you do? As I say, it doesn't excuse it, but human nature often dictates that we take the path of least resistance. Habitual, familiar, and taken for granted practices can be enacted mindlessly without conscious thought. We learn from the people that we work for and with. And as I say, that can both be a really good thing. A lot of times it is a really good thing, but sometimes it can be really bad. When we join a new organisation, you look to your team members, your manager, to see what behaviours they exhibit and try often and mirror these. That can shape what we think of as right and wrong in the workplace. And that's an example of another trait that's called bounded ethicality. In other words, our own boundaries are shaped by our peers. And it's really interesting, actually, as we've moved towards this hybrid working world in a post-COVID environment, where more people work from home, to think about how that might have shifted. And I definitely think that's an interesting area to explore. And the last bias that I wanted to mention is incrementalism. And that's the process where corruption's a gradual one, which might start with lesser misconduct, which gradually progresses more to engaging in more serious misconduct, a slippery slope. And probably one of the best examples, one of the examples that I cited from my paper, there are many more, was the Enron scandal of a number of years ago. Their accountants helped them effectively conceal billions of dollars of debt until it was too late and they went bankrupt. How did that happen? Well, the unethical conduct built up gradually. And it can be much harder to spot when that happens. It's also hard to spot, I must say, when, as in the Enron case, there are conflicts of interest where Enron were being paid for consultancy services. And I think reflecting on all of that, it's important, really important to consider and be aware of how we make decisions and how biases can affect that. And that was really the main point of my paper. Once you've recognised that, how do we then put in place mechanisms to support it, such as committing to how you will make decisions in advance and putting in place and relying on independent mentors. So there were just some of the ideas from the paper. I'll stop there and let Babatunde have his go. Thank you.
Thanks, Ross. And we'll come back to this definitely in the conversation. Thank you so much. Babatunde, going to spotlight you here.
Sure.
Over
Lovely.
to you.
Thank you so much for your engaging commentary, Ross, and as well as Julie. So thank you so much as well for inviting me to speak here. So my name is Babatunde Onabajo, but feel entirely free to call me Baba or Babs, if that suits you. So I wrote my paper called When Banks Do Not Always Know Best back in 2018, when I worked at the London Internet Exchange. The paper examined the ethical implications of using contactless technology, particularly in regards to payments, which in some, and over the past few years or so, we've been transitioning to a cashless society. In some ways it's natural, but in other ways it's also somewhat coerced. And it's being somewhat coerced through banks, through a psychological mechanism known as nudge theory. So many countries around the world are transitioning to a cashless society. I mean, some countries such as Sweden and Estonia, paying in a form that is cashless is now the norm rather than the exception. And when it comes to cities such as here in the UK, such as London, a great portion of it is cashless. Public transport is a good example. They used to accept cash before, but now it's effectively all cashless. Yet this raises a number of ethical questions that I discussed in my paper. Banks and other financial institutions are insistent on recommending that customers use cashless payments. And this raises, first of all, the question of free will. And my paper looked at the topic of nudge theory, as well as what's known in the academic literature as libertarian paternalism. That is to say that banks provide contactless cards, exploiting a cognitive bias that many of us have, which is that we tend to stick with what we are given, which is also technically known as the default bias. Whereas people, had it not been the default, would choose not to do so. Leading thinkers in the field of nudge theory include Cass Sunstein as well as Richard Thaler, who received a Nobel Memorial Prize in Economic Sciences several years ago. A transition to a cashless society also raises the issue of demographics, particularly along the lines of age. Those who are older, as some of us may have experienced ourselves if we have relatives who are in the elderly range, tend to show a preference for cash over cashless payments. And a transition to cashless payments can inadvertently leave that demographic out of the loop, not making our society inclusive of those who are older. How we pay has become an increasingly important issue over these past few years. We saw during the COVID-19 pandemic, we saw a rapid shift to cashless payments to avoid what has now been established definitively as an unwarranted fear of transmitting COVID-19 through cash. In more recent times, we are seeing people want to use cash in order to manage their finance better due to the cost of living crisis, as we can see due to the situation in the commodities market as well as the war in Ukraine, and that's reflected in the above average inflation rate. So I would definitely recommend participation in the prize. My paper has been cited by other institutions such as universities, and a few years ago I actually got a job interview because someone actually read my paper due to being a participant in the prize. And there are some laws currently that are being passed in this country due to this issue that has been raised, and some members of parliament have actually read my paper as well. So in short, the prize is very prestigious. People do read it, and if you do get involved, there's also something called the Alumni Network, which is very, very engaging, and there's quite a number of very, very interesting discussions. I just took part in one a few days ago relating to cryptocurrencies and blockchain. So please do participate, and I look forward to reading your papers if you manage to win.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Babatunde. Okay, so I'm just going to change the setup here for a second, the view. We're now going to open it up for any discussions, comments, questions, and see if anyone has any thoughts on these very interesting ideas.
Yeah, thank you to all of you for your presentations.
So maybe as a summary, so we've covered a lot of ground here, which I think is very interesting. So looked at physical climate risk and the frameworks around justice and inclusion that need to be considered when making financial decisions and pricing in risk. Looked at more from an individual level, what circumstances can lead good people or bad, as you said, good people and bad people to make good and bad decisions. So some of those structures that are inherent in all of our everyday lives, and then using cashless payments as an example, looked also at how nudge theory and some of these structures can change society in ways that maybe we haven't really fully thought of or consented to, and the ethics around that. So does anyone have any questions, thoughts, comments for our panelists?
If there's no question, maybe I will start with one question to Babatunde, because Babatunde, you mentioned the case of Sweden where digitization is very advanced, and I think I read some time ago, it was quite interesting to see that there was some actually resistance, some opposition, notably from old people who were very much against the trend of digitization because they felt excluded from that trend. And I think the Swedish government or the Swedish authorities decided to slow down and to maintain cash as an obligation for the population, which I found quite interesting. I don't know what's your view on this.
Yes, I agree. Yes, that's actually true. So yes, in Sweden, they did pass a law that actually protected cash in some respects, so that the elderly are not completely excluded. And in fact, actually, the same thing's actually due to occur here in the United Kingdom. So the situation in the United Kingdom is that quite a number of banks, physical banks, are closing down because banks believe that people, or they believe that people are just making like online payments and just using cashless payments. But many members of parliament have raised concerns that this is actually excluding particularly the elderly and people in rural areas as well, who might actually need to go to a physical bank to use a physical means of payment. So there's actually a bill currently underway, even here in the United Kingdom, that is ensuring that some level of cash is accessible so that the elderly are not permanently excluded from participating or paying for important items.
Thank you.
I have a question for Ross. Ross, one of the things that I was thinking about when you were talking is kind of governance structures, which we know is one of the ESG, the G. Where in the governance structure, or maybe it's multiple places, do you think we need to build in safeguards against some of these things that lull us into potentially taking bad decisions? Do you see it at more the executive board level in policies, or is it really an individual's responsibility based on what you saw in your paper?
Well, that's a good question. I think it's a bit of both, if I can dodge the direct answer to the question. I mean, really, I was thinking mostly about individual responsibility when I was doing my research. I actually started with the premise that you know, I wanted to be able to show that it was all about the environment. It was all about the environment that one was placed in, and you can exclude all other factors. I think that was a bit of a false premise to begin with. It's quite hard actually to really get under the skin of how our particular backgrounds might lead an individual to behave unethically. And so really for me, it was actually about thinking, here's how we make decisions. Here's the circumstances we do it. We can react often to short-term pressures rather than long-term factors. And what are the kind of structures that you could put in place as an individual, or indeed an organization could put in place to disrupt that. And if there's, once you figure out how people make decisions, there's definitely ways in which you can think about what's the way in which you structure your governance. So for me, it was actually thinking about, well, what are the mechanisms, not just to challenge, but to challenge from outside the direct line of control. And that's why I got particularly interested in mentorship, which again, doesn't necessarily have to be something that's mandated from the executive, but actually can happen quite organically for a number of different reasons and with a number of different benefits, ethical decision making just being one of them. So I think I do overall, I do think we all have individual responsibility, and that can't be ceded to just a corporate governance structure. But if you don't have a corporate governance structure, it's a bit like maintaining the garden. It's just going to get worse and worse. So that's really how I see that point.
Thanks, Ross. Julie, on the climate side, I know you kind of spoke to a couple of solutions, but I'm curious if you looked at other solutions in your paper and what you would recommend for institutions who are trying to approach this in an equitable way from, I guess, the pricing side. I know that's a big question. So even if you have another solution that you looked at in your paper.
Definitely, that's it. It is a big question. My conclusion more and more since I wrote the paper is that policy is really the solution here. The European Union is far ahead of North America on this. So trying to calibrate what I say to my audience here. Essentially, you know, I worked at an impact investor and our investments were incredibly positive. And I realized that's really just a drop in the bucket to shift the entire financial system. The rules of the game have to change. I'm sure many of you come from financial institutions that are also doing positive work, but the whole system might be moving in the other direction. So some of the key points, the key policy positions I pointed out in my paper. First is trying to encourage or incentivize disaster clauses in any debt. You know, the risks of climate change increase the cost of capital primarily through debt payments and debt investments. So disaster clauses mean that debt payments through interest can be paused after a natural disaster in a country. So that doesn't really solve the problem of getting capital to the vulnerable regions, but it does reduce the ongoing burden of debt, which is significant for vulnerable and less wealthy countries. The other recommendation is to mandate emission reduction targets for the financial sector. You know, I know the EU through SFDR, CFRD has incentivized and, you know, regulated for the financial sector to move in line with the net zero strategy Fit for 55. In Canada, as a contrast example, our government has put out kind of targets and targets for emission reduction in almost all industries, but not for the financial sector. And the financial sector should absolutely be encouraged in that, because the only way to really consider environmental justice and climate justice holistically is to mitigate the effects of climate change to the extent we can now. So emission reduction targets are an probably very hard, but, or pardon me, probably the easiest proxy, even though that's still difficult and requires quite a bit of change to how our financial system is working now.
Great, thanks, Julie. Boris, did you have a comment? I saw your camera come on there, or question?
Yes, thanks, Kaylee. I have a question for Julie, actually. The other day, I was like talking with a person who works for an investment firm, and he works on the risk. And he was saying that, in fact, it's good on the paper, but for him in his job, even though I'm sure he's like really convinced to kind of like try to do the best for the planet, ethical investing, etc. He was saying that he's kind of like, it works on the paper, but in reality, for investors of this size, it is very difficult to actually consider the climate risk inside their investment. It is more something that they can maybe assess how much given like companies are like considering this climate risk, or more at this level. But for an investor who has to manage, I don't know, 100 or 1,000 of like different companies, to kind of like really integrate this risk is good on the paper, but in reality, it cannot really be done. This is what he was saying. I was just wondering if this is something that you face as not even a criticism, but like a limit of like the work you've been doing, and what is your answer to this in a way? Yeah.
Thank you for the question, Boris. So I think what you're getting at here is that some of the modeling that can help investors understand the physical climate risks is significantly underdeveloped. And that's a whole other topic about the fact that the climate models that investors use are increasingly recognized as deeply insufficient. So scenario modeling of physical climate change is not up to spec yet, and encourages other perverse incentives. But despite the limitations of climate models, investments are already less accessible to climate vulnerable countries due to climate risk. So a paper in 2018 commissioned by United Nations Environment Program showed that vulnerable countries were already paying 117 basis points more on their debt servicing because of their climate risk. And that, I'm sure, has only increased in the 5 years since, right, as investors become more sophisticated and aware of climate risks. But the ability to integrate physical climate risk into an investment decision is still certainly underdeveloped, and a lot of that has to do with the insufficiency of existing models. Hope that wasn't too technical.
Thanks so much. Did anyone else have a question at the moment? If not, I have another one for Babatunde. Okay. Babatunde, one thing I found really interesting about your overview is that you really looked at, or you talked about this default bias and how I think we as individuals, I mean, I'm probably the most, the biggest culprit of just kind of sometimes going with the flow of what's given to us. And I think, especially when it comes to things like getting your bank card or these things where they almost just seem like absolutely part of everyday life. What would you suggest, or what did your research show individuals can do to push back on these systems? You mentioned the policies in Sweden, but are there things that we as individuals can do to kind of challenge some of these systems around sustainable finance or cashless payments, whatever it may be?
That's actually that's an excellent question. And that's one of the problems with nudge theory, is that it interferes with the things that happen to us on a subconscious level. And because it's so it's so almost invisible, we sometimes don't even recognize the choices that we make. So it's actually very hard to actually to prescribe like a particular set of things that people can do. But one thing I did suggest in the paper, and I think is also implied in the paper, is that when people do make decisions, they should think more carefully about what exactly is influencing them to choose what exactly they are choosing. To always ask themselves, why am I seeing, or why these particular set of choices being given to me? So I think the standard example in nudge theory literature is the example of one goes into a cafeteria and they see a particular group, particular arrangement of food, one should always ask themselves, well, why is that food always there? So it's always, I think it's about growing and always asking yourself, why exactly am I doing what I'm doing? And one of the things that the paper also pointed to, and actually it's going centuries back, was an example by the British philosopher John Locke. So he was debating about the issue of free will. So he asked, if a man wakes up in a locked room, and he discovers that well, maybe he thinks that he wants the room to be locked, but he finds that it's already locked. Does he truly have free will? So I think it's about asking ourselves and trying to be cynical and always asking ourselves, why exactly are we seeing the things that are around us? Because perhaps it's not there by accident, but rather by design.
Interesting. I'm not seeing any more questions in the chat, but someone did make a comment that said another aspect in a cashless society is also the data protection. I'm not sure if you looked at that at all.
Yes, I did. I actually responded to, in fact, I actually wanted to make like an intervention. Yes, I actually really agreed with Dietrich Wild's comment that, yes, one issue of the cashless society is that the authorities or the powers that be are much more, they're much more likely to see, what's going on in our personal lives. In fact, there's been several examples where this has already happened, even if it's not so much with regards to cashless payments, but just to do with our purchases. So there was an example a few years back where a large supermarket in the United States had actually sent out basically maternal things to a woman who wasn't, like, she actually did, I don't think she even knew that she was pregnant, but based on their statistical algorithms, they're able to detect that because she's purchasing a certain number of things, she's probably likely to be pregnant in a particular set of months. And it raises a number of questions with regards to privacy about what exactly businesses or the government know about us. In China as well, there's that issue of data protection is also quite topical because, as you know, compared to the Western world, China is much more of a it follows much more of a communistic model. And in China, a number of the state-owned enterprises, they basically collect the data, and the Chinese government uses it for things such as what is known as social credit scores. So they rate how much your behavior is aligned with the values of the Chinese Communist Party, and some people find that somewhat controversial. So that's a very, very major issue with regards to cashless societies, that everything we do, and I would say for most people, their finances is a very, very intimate part of their lives. In fact, it sometimes happens that even married couples won't know the finances of the other person's finances. So to have a cashless society, it does raise very, very important questions about privacy and data protection. And it's a very good and it's an excellent point. And we could be here all day. It's actually something that animates me a lot, but we could be all day talking about the various issues that have come to the fore because of it.
Great, thank you so much for that. So we have a question here. This will be our last one. This is from Benjamin. He would appreciate having your view on a recent target missed by bond issuer Public Power Corp. As the company failed to miss their sustainability linked bond target, the interest step up, but I didn't see exclusion from the ESG index or major selling flow. How should we consider that situation? Bond issuer just needs to pay more in the case if they fail and just keep running. Okay, so this is related to sustainability linked bonds. So they missed the target and they had an interest step up, but the question is, should that have larger implications? I'm not sure if anyone wants to jump in on that. Anyone know a little something about sustainability linked bonds?
I can step forward quickly.
Sure. Thanks, Jill.
So yes, the way sustainability linked bonds work, in case anyone is less familiar, is essentially that for achieving a positive social or environmental impact, the company is allowed to pay lower interest. And if they don't meet that impact target or return, they have to increase the financial return to the investor. So, I mean, the interest rate step up is natural and built in. Sustainability linked bonds have receive a host of criticisms about how the targets are designed. But then also you raise a great question about what happens after if it's missed. I think the kind of efficient market-based response would be that people will price that in when considering future Power Corp sustainability linked bonds. I'll kind of fall back on my horse of policy and regulation, which is that I think there needs to be a lot clearer rules around sustainability linked bonds, as these are, what financial innovation of recent, and the purchasers need greater assurance that their money is truly going towards what they expect it to. In the interest of it being, 3 minutes to the hour, I'll leave it there.
Great, thanks, Julie. Virgil, can you remind us one more time the deadline for the prize? This
Yeah, sure.
submission.
Yes, so the deadline is 29 May. So you still have a few weeks to register for the competition. And as I said in the introduction, everybody under 35 years old is welcome to contribute. You have to write an essay on ethics and or sustainability in finance, and you can register on our website. It's fairly easy. And also I put in the chat the link to the essays of our 3 alumni, but also you will find all the winning essays for the prize, so you can take a look at the topic. Again, there are other topics which were maybe not mentioned, but some previous winners wrote about fintech, blockchain, Islamic finance, so there's plenty of possible topics.
Great, thank you so much, Virgil. For me, I think what this discussion has really shown is that it's so crucial that we look at this big picture of sustainable finance and the financial system we want from multiple lenses. We talked about the individual, we talked about institutions, policy, and we all know that sometimes things that are legal are not ethical, and that sometimes there's multiple entry points that are needed in order to create the system that ultimately delivers on the values that we hopefully hold a society around sustainability. So for me, this has been really eye-opening in going beyond kind of the day-to-day discussions we have around these issues and really thinking about the ethics behind it. And I want to thank our 3 former winners for their really interesting interventions. I like that they spanned a lot of different things. I think that helps us to think about all the different ways that ethics can be applied. And I really encourage you, if you know people who are in finance, whether they be academics or people working in the sector or in NGOs, to submit a paper to the prize and to raise the level of understanding and knowledge and awareness around how important this topic is. So thank you all so much for attending. Thank you again to the Obervatoire de la Finance and the former prize winners for being here. And I look forward to continuing these conversations and seeing who the winners of the next prize will be. Thank you so much, everyone. Have an excellent day.
Thank you, Kali. Thank you, Julie. Thank you, Ross. And thank you, Babatunde. All the best. Thank you. Bye-bye.